So every now and then I poke my head into the Catholicism subreddit, which if you're not familiar with, it's just like the big Catholic group on Reddit. And someone had posted a question there that caught my eye, which was, can Catholics listen to heavy metal? And the reason this caught my eye is because prior to becoming a Catholic, I was a big metal fan, a metalhead, if you will. I wasn't just a fan, I was a practitioner. As a guitar player, this was a big reason I liked heavy metal. The songs were long, complicated, full of intricate guitar riffs that I enjoyed learning and playing, and which helped me to develop my skills a lot faster than if I was practicing on other genres. For me, it was an all-consuming identity, kind of like a religion. Like I was devoted to my favorite bands. I owned all their albums. I had posters on my walls. I had stickers on my car. I listened to it unceasingly, kind of like how St. Paul expects us to pray in 1 Thessalonians. But when I became a Christian, I suddenly felt these two identities fall into a kind of a tension. Because for as long as I've been a Christian, I've tried to be attentive to the effects of grace on my soul, because I'm someone who desperately needs it. I know the kind of person I was before a life of faith and prayer, and I know what kind of person I was going to become, and I know how dramatically that changed with the effects of grace. So anything that competes with that grace has always been, I'd say, pretty pronounced to my perception. And the music I habitually listened to became one of those things I started to pay close attention to. All of which is to say, when someone asked about it on Reddit, I was interested to see if anyone shared my experience. And while I didn't read all the comments, the top ones that I did see all affirmed the same thing, which was that, yes, heavy metal is perfectly compatible with your Catholic faith. Most of the replies went something like this: of course you can listen to heavy metal and be Catholic. I love heavy metal and I'm Catholic. Another one said something like, we really need to stop regulating people's entertainment. To which I immediately thought, you honestly think that society overly regulates people's entertainment? In an age when we've completely embraced cultural relativism and most 10-year-olds are going to bed with little screens under their pillows that give them unlimited access to every possible curiosity, including pornography, I think we could use a lot more regulating what people find appealing in their entertainment. And the same is kind of true of the church. We live in this age in which every worldly flavor is coming at us from every angle, trying to capture our interests, and nobody's talking about the potential risks of what we listen to and watch in our media and music, which we spend a lot of time doing. But the ancient philosophers and the church fathers talked about this quite a bit, at a time in which our exposure was quite a bit more limited than it is now. Now, because this is such a neglected question of our age, I think it's really important that we look to great thinkers of the past who did address it. C.S. Lewis argued that all things being equal, if you have to choose between reading old books or new books, you should choose the old books, because new books are trapped in the prejudices of our own age, prejudices that you probably already share as a child of that age. Old books can correct a lot of the modern errors. We don't even notice our errors because we've simply absorbed them through something like osmosis, because they're so ubiquitous in our times. He said thinkers of the past, they're not infallible. They'll make mistakes, but they won't make the mistakes that are common today, which is it's like a breath of fresh intellectual air and perspective you wouldn't otherwise be exposed to. It's a helpful correction to a lot of what we take for granted today. So because there's such a deafening silence on this topic today, which seems to have convinced all the Catholic Redditors that this is the same as like a carte blanche permission, and since great thinkers of the Western tradition of the past did spend some serious effort to address questions of appropriateness in art and music, stands to reason we should consult those past thinkers. And in the church's intellectual tradition, there are two currents we can look to, which are faith and reason. Faith tells us about the content of revelation, or the things that we could only know because God told us about it. He revealed it to us. That's where we get the word revelation, which this question doesn't fall into. So that means we can look to the tradition of reason. And in the church, that tradition has been extremely inclusive of two major pre-Christian philosophers, which are Plato and Aristotle. And man, did they have a lot to say on this topic. Plato especially talks about the effects music has on the soul, and especially on young people. As he proposes his ideal city-state in the Republic, he says that poets who fixate on dirges and lamentations, or in other words, excessively depressing or negative material, that they should be censored for the ill effects that they'll have on people. And he also points out something that should be obvious, but for some reason we are entirely blind to, which is that certain modes of music, certain styles communicate the same negative sentiments, whether they have lyrical content or not. And for the same reason that we should avoid excessively negative poetry, he says we should also avoid excessively negative sounding music. Now, Plato's Republic is a bit bonkers in terms of its actual legislative proposals, but it does make incredibly profound philosophical points. And in this case, Plato's concern about music is that it affects the soul and it arouses our passions for good or for bad. Good forms of music have good effects and bad forms have bad effects. This is a foundational premise that was adopted by all the saints, fathers, and the doctors that go on to address this subject. And it really should not be that controversial. Obviously, there are good forms and bad forms of music. I think most people can admit that if they're being honest. But then those same people, even if they're Christian, will refuse to actually admit that specific examples resemble the bad form. Aristotle, as with many things, he takes a slightly more moderate view than Plato. He says that music appeals to our enthusiasm. It gets us excited to want to participate in whatever it is that is arousing our interests. And that enthusiasm is an emotion of the ethical part of the soul. It's what we adhere to. It's what we endorse voluntarily. He goes on to say that music moves our emotions to sympathy for whatever it is that they portray, which is to say that we are swayed, we are moved, we are affected in our state of mind and emotion by the music we choose to expose ourselves to. And again, this is so obvious it should hardly need to be said. He then explains that music is pleasing and that virtue consists in rejoicing in what is good and hating what is bad, so that it's a noble thing to aim to be someone who makes right judgments about good and evil, and to have our passions or your emotions governed by those same judgments according to our reason. Therefore, music that portrays what is noble and virtuous maintains that alignment. It encourages it, it reinforces it. Music that stirs up our passions out of alignment with what we judge to be good and beautiful is therefore contrary to virtue. And these themes all get picked up by the church fathers with one addition, which is that they are extremely cautious, if not overtly hostile, to secular forms of music. Fathers like Clement, Saint Clement of Alexandria, Saint John Chrysostom, Saint Augustine, Saint Basil the Great, they all touched on the differences between good and bad music. They said that the good should be modest, ordered especially, and that it should strengthen virtue and elevate the mind to God and to prayer. Anything that is disordered, overly sensual, theatrical, or overly arouses passions like lust or frivolity or rage, or makes mere pleasure its end, those should be rejected. And then St. Thomas Aquinas, the universal doctor of the church, he picks up all of these themes. He says that music it's not morally neutral. It works on the passions of the soul, imitating those passions, echoing what Aristotle says. He says the good kind disposes the soul to piety, to contemplation, and to virtue, and the bad kind seeks pleasure as its end at best, and at worst it stirs up our passions to a disordered pitch out of alignment with virtue and reason. So how does this all apply and compare to heavy metal? The first thing to notice is that there were no forms in the ancient or medieval world that would be comparable to what we call heavy metal today. The closest thing might have been like songs designed to arouse the fighting spirit in soldiers heading off to battle, which both Aristotle and Thomas, if I remember correctly, said was a good thing in its proper context. So because there's no version of metal in their day, we have to try to apply their principles to the question. And in evaluating any music, Plato said that we have to look at three things, which are the melody, the rhythm, and the lyrics. And all three of those stood out to me when I started asking the question if this was fitting to listen to as a Christian. But the lyrics were especially notable. Because if we're being honest here, like the majority of metal lyrics are completely incompatible with virtue, contemplation, and Christian piety. A lot of the bands I listen to, like Opeth, In Flames, Iron Maiden, they fixated a lot of attention on demonic themes, if not outright fascination or glorification of the devil. And if it wasn't that, they were talking about like violence, morbid curiosities, vulgar ideas, rebellion, or just what Plato called dirges and lamentations. In fact, actually, Opeth has a song called The Dirge of November and an album called Lamentations. And the reason those kinds of themes were and are so ubiquitous in metal is because they fit the style. The sound of metal is angry and dark. Just look at the bands who are credited for first establishing that sound. Ozzy Osbourne. He used to say that they were just spellbound by chord progressions and modes that sounded like what he called doom music. And yes, not all metal songs have a dark or demonic content, but I think that that would be an exception. So to try to cite, like Christian metal bands or the odd song that breaks the mold, it's not a good way to draw general principles or to try to define something like metal. Trying to make rules out of the unusual or the exceptional is called the Converse accident fallacy. It's like noticing a blind person using a seeing eye dog and then concluding that every dog owner uses their dog for navigation. Exceptions are exceptions for a reason, and the reality is that the broad defining themes of heavy metal are often in stark and even explicit opposition to Christianity. It might be true that not all metal bands are satanic, but it is a pretty accurate statement to say that most satanic bands occupy some subgenre of heavy metal, and it's not by accident. So that's the lyrical content, but then if we move on and talk about the rhythm and melody side, again, if we're being honest, metal is designed to stir up extreme emotions, and they're clearly negative emotions, either anger or lamentation. Now, St. Thomas doesn't treat anger as merely bad because virtue consists in doing the right thing at the right time. And there are some times when anger is the absolute most appropriate response, like in the face of serious injustice. But to just start streaming your favorite metal song when you're in the car or at home is to needlessly stir up negative emotions when nothing in your immediate circumstances is calling for it. Like when I was younger with my friends and we would go on snowboarding trips to the mountains, on the last leg of the drive up the mountain to the parking lot, we'd always throw in Metallica's Master of Puppets because we wanted to get, quote, pumped up. But what it really meant was we wanted intense feelings to encourage us to do what we perceive to be an intense activity, which freely admits the effects that music can have on your state of mind, if not your soul. But the problem is we were mistaking intense rage and negativity for just intensity in general because we were so desensitized to the modern experience of sensory overload that the only way we could feel something intensely is if it were on the extreme end of the spectrum. So when I first became a Christian, I couldn't have articulated these points, but I just intuitively knew that the metal I was so attached to was completely incompatible with the newly adopted faith. So for my first Lent, I threw away all my CDs, I took down all the posters, and I just gave it up. And the effects weren't at all subtle. And even today, I'll sometimes return to it for various reasons, often nostalgia. And if I'm paying attention, it usually has negative effects on me, especially as a husband and father, because I have 8 kids, a busy work schedule, all of which just demands a lot of me. So if anything in my prayer life or my state of mind gets thrown out of calibration, I notice it because I start to struggle to manage all of these responsibilities. I become irritable and impatient. I even start to stray into certain vices that I thought I had a clear handle on. And even though it sounds like I'm picking on heavy metal here, I would say that this is true. These criticisms are true of all top 40 music. Everything our culture upholds and celebrates is the kind of stuff that the fathers and the doctors and even the pagan philosophers would have rejected as completely incompatible with faith and virtue. And if I can be so bold to suggest, they would also be just horrified to see us incorporating these genres of music into our worship of God. So if you aren't convinced by everything I've said, let me offer you a challenge in closing to take just like a 1-week fast from any kind of music that stirs up your passions the way the great thinkers of old describe. Try listening to someone like Paul Jernberg, who can be found on Spotify and YouTube, and who has written some of the most beautiful modern compositions, including the intro and outro music on my videos. And if you don't find yourself more peaceful, more patient, more able to pray and to dwell in silence, less restless, less irascible, then maybe there's something to what I'm talking about. That's definitely the experience I've had, and it continues to be confirmed every time I let myself go back to listening that kind of music. Okay, thanks for watching that. I hope that that was a blessing to you, that it encouraged you and edified you in your journey with the Lord. And if it did, and if you want to support the work that we're doing as a result, which thank you so much for considering that, because we really do need your help to make this viable. Then there's a few ways you can do that. You can go to brianholdsworth.ca/help, which is obviously my website. And there's some options there. One is to just contribute through my website. The other would be to join us over on Locals, where you can interact with me and other like-minded people. You can gain access to exclusive content, where we're doing live streams and I'm uploading videos and things like that. But we're also doing a secret philosophy study with a secret philosopher academic who's joining us once a month to take us through difficult texts that we want to read on our own, but we need some clarification and some guidance on that. So right now we're working through some works by St. Thomas Aquinas with him, and he's a Thomistic philosopher. So if that's interesting to you, join me on brianholdsworth.locals.com. And again, you can check out my website at brianholdsworth.ca/help.